The Russians are hacking pretty much away wherever they want to. I've argued that they hacked the DNC data. They or the Chinese hacked the Office of Personnel Management. I'm sure our government knows which, but they won't tell us. They've hacked into the Pentagon. They've hacked into the State Department. They've hacked into the NSA, into the White House, the National Security Council. So they're hacking away. This is called cyber warfare. Cyber warfare. And if they have the ability to get into our data, they have the ability to manipulate it and destroy it. And this is a huge problem. So, what about this election coming up? Should the government nationalize state control of elections in order to protect them from hackers? Check this out. Go.
The FBI says it has found breaches in voter registration systems in both Illinois and Arizona, and it's urging states to increase their computer security ahead of the November presidential election. Much of the information in voter files is already public, and officials say attempts to access the files aren't necessarily aimed at manipulating votes. But the news comes as U.S. intelligence officials have become increasingly worried that hackers, sponsored by other countries, may try to disrupt the election.
Stop. First, she says that experts say it's not really to manipulate the vote. Then she says there's a concern that hackers will try and affect the election. Well, they don't need the information that's in the database about voters, do they really? I mean, know where you live and so forth and so on. That isn't of particular import to North Korea or Iran or China or Russia or any of the rest of them. Obviously, they want to affect the election. They want to attack our democratic processes. That's what they're all about. They want to attack the heart of our system. And for the life of me, I don't know why we don't attack back. Well, I do know why, because Obama's in charge. Go ahead.
White House spokesman Josh Earnest says that's prompted the administration to consider whether federal officials should step in to ensure the security of the system.
Stop. That's the big issue. The federal government stepping in to secure the system. I'll have more on this in a second. Go ahead.
There has been a discussion about whether or not to designate certain voting systems that are, of course, maintained at the state and local level as pieces of critical infrastructure.
Stop. Listen to this. This is very important. The language I use, pieces of critical infrastructure. That language, critical infrastructure, allows the Department of Homeland Security and other parts of the federal government to step in to secure critical infrastructure. Never, ever had anything to do with the ballot box, the precincts, the voting process. Critical infrastructure means exactly what it sounds like. Bridges, roads, certain buildings, certain data, that kind of, not the election process, critical infrastructure. This is what this president and this administration does all the time. They take statutes, to the extent they pay any attention to them, and they turn them upside down. And they abuse the language in order to grab power, And what's happening here, step by step, is through the Department of Homeland Security, this notion of critical infrastructure, the threat of hackers, Russian and otherwise, they seek to nationalize state legislative decisions about the voting processes in the states. I hope that's clear, because if this violates the theme of the constitutional ratification process throughout the states, where the states insisted that the primary responsibility for determining the election process is with the states, precisely because they didn't trust this central government that they were creating in the Constitution to have control over it, and thereby have control over the people. Go ahead.
And that would give the federal government and experts of the federal government more of a role in assisting the administrators of those networks as they deter intrusions.
The FBI alert about the data breaches did not identify the intruders, but security experts say recent breaches of the Democratic Party computers were probably carried out by people within the Russian government. Kremlin officials deny the allegations.
And so the Russians have interfered with federal databases all over the place, as I mentioned. And so our federal security apparatus is Swiss cheese. So why would the feds come in and help the states when the feds can't help the feds? And they're not really talking about helping the states. If they trigger this infrastructure issue, they don't need the state's permission. They can step in on their own. This should not be something that's taken lightly. This should be rejected, in my view. There's a piece in Politico, which basically is a quasi-news site for the left. And for the rhinos, they leak to this all the time. But it's worth taking a look at it by Eric Geller. Election security, federal help, or power grab? The federal government wants to help states keep hackers from manipulating the November election amid growing fears that the U.S. political system is vulnerable. Again, I want to stop there. So where's the expertise of the federal government, given the fact that virtually any database, the Russians, the Chinese, the North Koreans, the Iranians, or others have wanted to breach, have been breached? But Georgia's top election official is balking at the offers of assistance and accusing the Obama administration of using exaggerated warnings of cyber threats to intrude on state authority. See, most of you, and this Georgia top election official do not trust the Obama administration because we know it grabs power whenever it can, under any pretext. Georgia Secretary of State Brian Kemp's objections add to the bumpy start for the Department of Homeland Security's attempt to shore up safeguards for the election during a summer when cyber attacks on the DNC have called attention to the weaknesses across the electoral system. The DNC, is that a state government database? No, it's not. It's the Democrat Party's database, located in Washington, D.C. Cybersecurity experts call tougher protections long overdue for parties, political advocacy groups, and voting machinery, but DHS's efforts risk becoming caught in the same partisan arguments about state sovereignty that have hung up programs such as President Obama's Medicaid expansion. Now, you see, we all exist to follow along with Barack Obama. Let me mark this right here. Otherwise, we're partisan and we're getting in his way. I want you to look at and listen to Article 1, Section 4, Clause 1 of the Constitution. Can we put that up now? Okay. Let's read this carefully. The times, places, and manner of holding elections for senators and representatives shall be prescribed in each state by the legislature thereof. But the Congress may at any time by law make or alter such regulations, except as to the places of choosing senators. Is there any language in there, keep this up, is there any language in there about the executive branch? Any department of the executive branch? About the President of the United States? That by fiat they can make these decisions? This is exactly why the Department of Homeland Security is looking at an existing statute that has nothing to do with elections and trying to twist it like a bunch of slip and fall snake oil lawyers. Twist the language, change the language, change the history of an existing statute that has nothing to do with this. Nothing. This issue, Article 1, Section 4, Clause 1, didn't just happen to show up in the Constitution. The delegates to the Constitutional Convention insisted on it. So much of what this president and this administration do is trampling on our traditions, trampling on our Constitution. These are the kinds of issues that ought to be on national television news every single night. The unraveling of this republic, any excuse, any threat, and yet, when it comes to real threats, people coming into this country, seeking to do us harm, hiding among refugees, they act like it's no big deal. There, the federal government has the power to protect the country. There, the federal government has the power to protect the states and the people of the states. And it won't. Instead, they're proud of the fact that they got 10,000 Syrian refugees in here well before their own set deadline of October 1st. They don't do what's necessary to protect us against our enemies, to protect us against people who wish to do us ill will. And yet, when it comes to power, they're insatiable. They can't stop. Now let's go on. Back to the Politico piece. It seems like now it's just the DC media and the bureaucrats because of the DNC getting hacked. They now think our whole system is on the verge of disaster because some Russian's going to tap into the voting system, Kemp, a Republican, told Politico in an interview. And that's just not, I mean, anything is possible, but it's just not probable at all the way our systems are set up. During an earlier interview with the site NextGov, Kemp warned, the question remains whether the federal government will subvert the Constitution to achieve the goal of federalizing elections under the guise of security. Kemp told Politico he sees a clear motivation from this White House to expand federal control, citing Obamacare's health care law, the Dodd-Frank financial legislation, and the increased role of the Education Department and local schools. And he's exactly right. Election officials in other states expressed less fear of Washington, but said they understand why some might worry about an expanding federal role in election security. And it's not just an expanding federal role in election security. You know, it wasn't that long ago when you didn't have early voting, where if you were not going to be able to physically show up and vote, and you wanted to vote early, you had to demonstrate that you were literally out of town, or that you were going to have some medical procedure or something, a list of requirements, if you were not going to vote on election day. And the reason that was done was to ensure the integrity of the vote, to ensure that the people had to show up, show their identification, demonstrate they lived where they live, they are who they say, that they have a right to vote, and then they get to vote. What happened is that our federal Congress, led by Ted Kennedy and Christopher Dodd and other leftists, they pushed for early voting, and they gave us all the reasons. It's inconvenient. People are handicapped. They can't get there on election day. People have to do this and people have to do that. So they gave all the reasons in the world. So the federal government then interfered in many states in this election process. They called it a civil right, among other things. And so now we have early voting. And it's earlier and earlier. And it's earlier and earlier, not to make sure more people who legitimately can vote, but to make sure it is almost impossible to ensure the integrity of the vote, so people who aren't allowed to vote, vote, which is exactly why the whole notion of voter identification now is under attack by the left, by the Democrat Party, and the only reason you would attack it is to ensure the lack of integrity of the vote. The lack of integrity of the vote. And so they call it like Jim Crow. If you want to see a voter ID. Oh, it's like Jim Crow. Everything's like Jim Crow or Selma. You know, the bathroom situation. It's like Selma, Alabama. It's nothing to do with it. Anyway, to some election officials, this sounds like the first stage of a more intrusive plan. I think it's kind of the nose under the tent, said Vermont Secretary of State Jim Condos, a Democrat. What I think a lot of folks get concerned about is when the federal government says, well, look, we're not really interested in doing that, but we just want to give you this, and then all of a sudden this leads to something else. Well, he's quite right, isn't he? Government control by the feds. Elections have always been run and organized by the states. The Connecticut Secretary of State, Denise Merrill, another Democrat. These are liberal Democrats, some of whom are at least tangentially concerned about this as well. The reason it has been historically a state issue is because the framers of the Constitution and the ratifiers in the states insisted on it. That's why. And Denise Merrill of Connecticut goes on, and I think there's always been a fear that there would be federal intervention that would not recognize differences among the states, because states get to set their own rules in terms of the hours the precincts are open, when they're open, early voting now, and such. Merrill added that it's unhelpful to have such alarming rhetoric about election security crop up so close to November. So the question is, ladies and gentlemen, why is Obama doing this now? Why didn't he do it in his first year, second year, fifth year, sixth year? Because they're going out the door. And they want to do as much damage to the system as is humanly possible. Whether it's private property rights, whether it's schooling, whether it's the vote, whether it's health care, whether it's immigration, the police departments, the United States military. Look at every conceivable area of life in this country, and you can see that they're all under attack by this menacing federal leviathan at the direction of the White House and these cabinet and agency heads, and they are just on a full tear. They're on a full tear. Now, what can we do about this? Every state in the country should resist this. Every governor, every attorney general, every secretary of state, most of whom overlook the election processes in their state, they should say no. They should take care of their own cybersecurity, do the very best that they can, set up procedures, but bringing in an incompetent federal department like the Department of Homeland Security that can't even secure our border, bringing in incompetence, they can't even set up a website for Obamacare. Federal government's full of incompetence. The states don't need Mr. Obama's help or the help of any of his flunkies. Just do the best that they can on their own. And you can always do one other thing. You know what works? The paper ballot. Remember that? Some of you are too young. I remember that. Well, the Russians can't hack that now, can they? That's it.